It's almost like a Polo movie.
That I know it is a little weird to present to. You have a lot of people in the room, I'll tell you that.
Fantastic.
Great.
So Sam, are you going to display the slides for us? There we go. So are we ready to get started?
Yeah, I guess we can get started, Bjorn.
Okay. So Josna and I decided to do a overview of Verizon's FIDO deployment. I represent the network at Verizon, and Josna is part of the device team. And so we've divided this presentation into 3 sections: the why, how, and where we deployed it. So if we go to the next slide, the why, what, and how. So we go to the next slide. Josna's going to start with why we decided to deploy FIDO and the flavor that we decided to. So Josna, take it away.
Thank you, Bjorn. So hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Josna, as Bjorn mentioned, and my team leads authentication and identity activities and requirements from a device perspective. So I'll talk about the why part of Verizon's journey to FIDO as an authentication solution. But before I begin the actual presentation, let me share a few interesting findings from 2021 Verizon DPIR report. So we did hear quite a few stats today. First, of course, the breaches, as always, continue to be mostly due to external financially motivated actors. 61% of breaches involved credential data. 83% of data compromised is personal. And this was from the financial and insurance industries. And fourth, phishing increased by 11% over last year. So, this statistics is just to show that, how often the security breaches are happening and the data continues to be compromised. And the key ask we get for our teams here is to have a best-in-class authentication solution. And that's one of the major motivations for our why aspects of journey to adopt FIDO. So for our customers, it is important, just to give you a background, that why from a business perspective, that for our customers, it is important that they're protected against the security breaches and against centralized repositories. Of course, passwords do increase delay and bring friction. But for Verizon, FIDO was strategic not only from customer first, but also security and privacy requirements. As well as, we get some business requirements that being able to support multi-channel, for example, have coverage across device ecosystem, and providing authentication assurance as needed. So what does FIDO bring from a technology perspective is, number one, like you see on my slide over here, is standards. Of course, being part of the device ecosystem, having a standard-based interoperable solution is key. And with these standards, we are able to leverage the mobile handset ecosystem for authenticators, the type of authenticators they're bringing, capabilities to secure private keys on devices, and other protocol support. The continuous work that FIDO is doing with, the working groups, liaison with other standards body, and ensuring that we have a secure and interoperable solution as our needs evolve is important. Second point is about leveraging the mobile device for the Verizon ecosystem and how it works for us as an MNO. So in addition to the OEM capabilities with FIDO, we are able to capture presence, for instance, and be able to secure consent as needed. Biometric data doesn't leave the device. It helps us meet many of the privacy regulations and allows us to deliver on a solution which is available across the board. And lastly, it is about scalability. We heard about scalability from multiple speakers previously. So for us, of course, we need to be able to scale for the subscriber base, but it's important that we are able to scale for our use cases. Our use cases keep evolving. Our business models are evolving. And as we are going from 4G to 5G, we believe that there will be many services and needs that will need to be addressed by the underlying architecture for authentication. So we should be able to bring in new authenticators and solve for business cases. Next slide, please. So this is to sum up why we chose UAF and what were some of the reasons that prompted us to go with the UAF architecture. So with this FIDO approach, we can provide the strongest means to authenticate for the user. What I mean is, like, we can bring the authenticator of choice that the user can use on the device. If they want to, if the application wants, they can provide the user with a way to bring a fingerprint or Face ID, do a combination. If they need it, we could bring a new authenticator. So we are able to bring new authenticators onto the device without requiring an software upgrade from the OEM, for example. An example that we will talk about later is Zenki. Zenki is able to use the biometric OEM authenticator and a PIN authenticator. So the applications do get control over UI and modality, which is much more. We are able to leverage device binding and silent capabilities along with the biometric indicators, providing a much stronger authentication capabilities. And of course, a key requirement, like I said, was we have to provide the applications with the ability to enable FIDO across the board on both Android and iOS ecosystems. The last point is about being able to do step up as needed. So with this approach, the applications, depending on the policy, can, bring up the authentication as a step as and when needed. For example, is the transaction high valued? Are they coming in from a different location? Or any other trust or risk factors. So it can happen on device, or you can be doing a browser session from a different device and use your device as a step-up authentication mechanism. So these are some capabilities we can leverage. And to sum it up, it worked well for our mobile-first approach. And just to keep in mind some of the other things that we had to keep in mind from an approach was to keep the onboarding and the user enrollment to FIDO, kind of experience they get on the device. Those are some of the considerations as they move from a native biometric UI support to FIDO enabled support. What kind of experience is available for the customers? So to sum it up, of course, it worked well for the mobile-first approach. And I wanted to thank you so much for your time and share my experiences. With that, over to you, Bjorn. Thank you.
Thanks, Josna. I wanted to emphasize one thing, that one of the benefit of FIDO is that it allows us to provide authentication services on 4G as well as 5G. So it is transparent to whether we operate a 4G or a 5G type of service. And it had allowed us to continue to grow the FIDO deployment on the use cases that we can support. So let's go to slide 5. So Verizon went through a vendor evaluation and ended up partnering with Knock Knock for our FIDO solution. So we have the Knock Knock solution deployed in a virtualized environment. And we're also using an SD that is integrated to the mobile application that leverages FIDO. We have supported a variety of authentication factors depending on what the use case is. One of the values we saw in FIDO when looking at various solution as well as standards was the ability to support various authentication factor. Most prominent at the time was biometrics. And as you all know, FIDO do not distinguish between what the private key is. So for us, that was a huge benefit of supporting various authentication factors that either the customer would prefer or that the use case would require. And so, as I said, we have an SDK that we integrate into our mobile applications. We support the multiple authentication factors that we support. We also have the ability to share the credentials between Verizon services. And you also heard Josna said that we do a device binding. So we added an EAP token to our process to bind the device to the user and the authentication factor. Go to the next slide. So Josna had mentioned that Zenki was one of the use cases. We picked Zenki as a use case for this presentation, but FIDO supports multiple of services and application for Verizon. Again, the user doesn't necessarily care whether we're using FIDO or not. They care about how they actually, what authentication factor they choose to use to access their service. But there are multiple services that is supported by FIDO for Verizon. So for the Zenki use case, for those not familiar with Zenki, Zenki is a joint venture between Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T to offer authentication services as well as verified attributes. And so it is based on the security of a wireless network. It is leveraging OpenID Connect for the federation part. There's also some additional implementations of proof of possession of your device and various cryptographic solution that leverage the wireless network. So that is the Zenki solution that we use for FIDO. So if we go to the next slide, I'll give an example of a user experience of Zenki experience using FIDO. So if a user wants to leverage Zenki, they first would have to download the application. And the journey starts with registering the app with Zenki, selecting the PIN for Zenki. So the Zenki app or the Zenki PIN is different from a Verizon PIN for your Verizon account or other services. And so for Verizon, you have a choice to authenticate using your My Verizon login, or you can use Zenki if you choose to. But the authentication factors are different for Zenki versus the Verizon services. After you have set up your Zenki account, we go into the FIDO implementation. So we go in and you can select your biometric authentication factor. So Zenki supports biometrics, and for Verizon, that means FIDO. And the user, again, can choose to do Face ID or fingerprints. So the server will indicate to the application what the options are, and that will be displayed to the user as they select what biometrics they would like to enroll for the Zenki service. So using Zenki, you would log in and you would have the Zenki pop up, and using the biometric that you have chosen to register with the FIDO to log into the account. Josna also mentioned the consent. So there is also a consent dashboard for the Zenki service that you manage your consent for what you share and how you share it. So this is a tidbit of Verizon's FIDO deployment, and also a sample use case of where we use FIDO for the authentication. Again, it is not the only service that we leverage FIDO for, and there are additional use cases that we're working on where we will support FIDO in a 5G environment. And that is the presentation. So Sam or whoever holds the mic, don't know if there's any questions for us or.
Sorry about that. I just had to run to the mic. It's Megan Shamus. Thank you so much, Bjorn and Josna.
That is okay.
Yeah, no.
That is okay.
I know you're probably wondering if anybody was here. We do have a full room. So we do have 2 mics set up. So if anyone has a question, you could either enter it into the app or step to the mic. And we do have about 5 minutes for questions. So let me just review. So one question is, you just mentioned that there's some additional use cases that you're looking at. Can you talk about any of that, or what next steps are with those use cases?
So in the 5G world, there are a couple of new concepts being introduced. One is called network slicing. And so network slicing is a concept where you virtually reserve network resources for a specific purpose. Today, we have private networks that we offer to enterprises. And network slice is where you do the same thing, but you virtualize it. So some of those services, I'll use mission critical services as an example for first responders, requires user authentication to give them access to that domain. We're positioning FIDO as part of that user authentication for first responders. Another concept or architecture enhancements of 5G is allowed to have a distributed network. And so you have more intelligence in the edge of your network. There are use cases where using this edge architecture to require user authentication for either access to a service or validating that you have access to certain properties that is being managed by Edge. And so that is where we're also going to leverage FIDO for the user authentication. Again, in the Verizon deployment, we have tightly coupled the FIDO authentication as well as our OpenID Connect implementation. So I don't know, Josna, if you wanted to add any additional use cases.
I think those are good examples. And of course, you know, it's important that we have the underlying capabilities, and we'll be able to leverage even the attestation capabilities of going from one device to another device. And it just opens up ability to do a lot of things differently. Especially with 5G, we'll see multiple new devices coming, you know, different from smartphones and other types of devices.
Thank you so much. So we do have a question in the room from Christian Brand.
Oh, I'm famous. I don't even have to say my name. Hello. I would have put the question in the app, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. Okay. So I guess I'll ask it here. So thanks for the presentation first off. This was great. I have a quick question though, and I think you started touching on it a little bit. How does identity proofing here work, or how does it work when I move from one device to another? I would assume I'll have to reestablish my Zenki identity on that new device, because, I mean, obviously, as we know, the biometric credentials won't be leaving the device and making its way over. So how does that initial identity proofing work? How do we make sure it's the same user so we can give them back their profile?
I don't know if you want to talk to that, Josna.
I think with Zenki, we are leveraging user authentication with our backend, with our Verizon systems. So it's Verizon authenticating for the initial identity proofing. We would want to be in a place where we can take, you know, the old device, be able to attest the user onto the new device so that, you know, you make it easier for the enrollment process and have a much more passwordless approach. So those are some things to keep in mind for from a growth perspective, from going from one device to another device for upgrades or bringing in secondary device like your wearables or laptop or tablet enrollment, so that you're not relying on your username password. That's something that I would share.
So I think the real question is about how do you manage account recovery? And so yes, if you drop your phone and it doesn't work, the FIDO credentials are obviously gone. Within Zenki, Zenki does not define the technology you use to what you deploy. It's how you support the requirements. They specify certain requirements. They specify the OpenID Connect flows between the central point and each MNO. As it happens, not all members have deployed FIDO. So what happened is that we had to come to a least common denominator for how to manage the various implementation of Zenki. And so that means that you have options that you would select in terms of how you do your account recovery. Options include sending an email that you reestablish your account, and other options to come to point of sales. I would say that any of the Zenki options is the best user experience. And part of that has to do with that this is a collaboration between 3 operators and that have a little bit different implementations as well as back office.
Thank you. We did have another question about account recovery from Libby. Did that address your question or? Okay, it did. So we do have a few more questions and we do have a little bit more time. I have a few questions in the app. Is there any more questions at the mic at the moment? Okay. So you mentioned a tight coupling between FIDO and OpenID. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that, Bjorn?
So, the tight coupling in this case is that FIDO is for federal identity. FIDO is used as an authentication factor. It is not the only authentication factor that we leverage. I'll use the mission critical services as an example where we use OpenID Connect for the initial authentication request, and based on whether the user has enrolled in register their FIDO, we would use FIDO Authenticator for the user authentication. There are other use cases where, again, the authentication request comes in using OpenID Connect, and again, the purpose of the user authentication is to get access to a privileged domain, and for that we use FIDO as well. And so it's more about how we marry the request to authenticate as well as the authentication method that we use. Because sometimes if the user is known, we recognize the device, we leverage the EAP credentials. For low-level assurance, we wouldn't require a FIDO authentication. But for higher assurance, the request would be to leverage FIDO. So the tight coupling is more about the use case and how the user journey starts for the user authentication.
Okay, thank you. One more question. So on the user journey, after the setup with Zenki, what are the steps that the user has to take to authenticate in Verizon on web and mobile?
Josna, do you want to take that? Because that's for how the My Verizon and the Zenki kind of interchange.
Right. So for Zenki, once they're set up, they are set up to, they don't have to do anything for getting into My Verizon. Is that the question? Like, let me understand the question one more time. That they set up the Zenki first and then logging into
yes,
My
exactly.
Verizon?
Right. So they've set up the Zenki, and what is their experience then with Verizon on the app and on mobile?
So when they set up their Zenki, and if they didn't have their setup for My Verizon, they would first be prompted to set up for My Verizon and then get into Zenki. And the place where we're trying to be is like if we're in My Verizon, for example, in the desktop experience, we do allow now users to leverage their Zenki as an app. So, to authenticate the user. So I can, when I go to my desktop and log into My Verizon, I get an option either to do the password-based option or log in using Zenki. And when I do Zenki, I get like a notification and use my fingerprint or Face ID, whatever biometric I've set up, and I'm logged into My Verizon mobile. So that would be the experience you would get. If you're already on your device, you're already set up for login using your biometric. So it would be just like you'll be prompted for your fingerprint or Face ID, and you'll be good to go.
So that's the same experience on web and mobile? I mean, on the app.
On the app, you just enter your biometric, like you set up, you say, yes, I'm good to go. If you're on your desktop, you typically get the experience for how you want to log in, and one of the options is log in with Zenki. And when you do that, you get a notification on your device, and then you just get a prompt for using your fingerprint, and they're into your My Verizon mobile, not My Verizon mobile, My Verizon desktop experience.
Okay, that makes total sense. Thanks for clarifying. Okay,
No
any
problem.
other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Josna and Bjorn, for being with us remotely. You did a wonderful job.
All right, thank you.
You're getting a big round of applause right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.